General Motors just posted a $7.6 billion write-down in a single year, first quarterly loss since the 2009 bankruptcy, net income cut in half. When a journalist in Detroit stood up at a press conference and asked CEO Mary Barra if she regretted any of it, she said no. Wall Street called it decisive leadership. The financial press called it staying the course. That is not what that is. That is the person responsible for the largest single-year capital destruction in GM's post-bankruptcy history, telling the workers, the dealers, the retirees, and the towns built around those plants that she would burn it all down again if given the chance. This is not a bad quarter. This is not a market correction. This is what happens when a CEO mistakes a press release for a strategy and spends 5 years proving it. The people who get hurt when General Motors makes these decisions are not on the stage in Detroit. They are running assembly lines in Orion, Michigan. They are managing dealer lots in Ohio full of vehicles nobody is walking in to buy. They are GM retirees watching a company they spent their careers building light $8 billion on fire and call it a North Star. I am going to walk you through every layer of how this happened. The promises that started it. The factories converted and then unconverted. The products so broken GM had to stop selling them. The robo-taxi that burned $10 billion and produced almost nothing. And the moment in Q4 2025 when the entire foundation collapsed at once. Stay with me through all of it because the last part, what Barra said on January 12, 2026 after watching all of this happen, is the part that tells you everything about who is running this company right now. Understand the scale of what went wrong, you have to start what was promised. Because this is not a story about a company that tried something ambitious and fell short. This is a story about a CEO who made specific, numbered, public commitments, attached her name to them, repeated them for years, and then missed every single one by a margin that would end most careers. In 2020, Barra stood in front of investors and called it the most important announcement in the history of General Motors. 30 new electric vehicles globally by 2025. $35 billion committed to electrification. And the headline number, 1 million units of North American EV production capacity by the end of 2025. These were not vague directional targets. They were slides. They were earnings call talking points. They were CNBC soundbites. Staked her credibility on them publicly and repeatedly because the pitch was simple. GM was not going to get left behind. GM was going to win. Here is the number that matters. GM sold 169,000 electric vehicles in all of 2025. Not 1 million, 169,000. That is an 83% miss on the single most visible commitment the CEO of the largest American automaker had ever made. If a contractor told you he was going to pour 1 million square feet of concrete and showed up with 169,000, you would not renew the contract. You would not call it long-term vision. Find someone else. That is not a miss. That is a different reality. The $35 billion commitment was not theoretical. It went into the ground. Went into steel and concrete and machinery. And what happened to those facilities tells you more about this strategy than any earnings call ever will. GM partnered with LG Energy Solution in a joint venture called Ultium Cells, 3 battery manufacturing plants, Warren, Ohio, Spring Hill, Tennessee, Lansing, Michigan, combined investment exceeding $7 billion. The Ohio plant came online in late 2022. Spring Hill followed in early 2024. The Lansing plant was supposed to push total production capacity past 130 gigawatt hours and cost another $2.6 billion on its own. In December 2024, GM sold its entire stake in the Lansing plant back to LG Energy Solution for roughly $1 billion. Think about that for a second. GM committed $2.6 billion to build that facility, walked away with $1 billion. LG now uses it to supply batteries to Toyota. A factory that was supposed to power GM's electric future is currently powering a competitor's product line. GM paid to build Toyota's battery supply chain. That is not a strategic exit. That is paying for someone else's kitchen and then handing them the keys. The Orion Assembly Plant in Michigan is the same story told in a different language. GM spent $4 billion converting Orion to manufacture electric trucks, the Silverado EV, the Sierra EV, retooled the entire facility, and then announced it was converting Orion back to internal combustion production. The $4 billion in conversion costs became an impairment charge. Then GM spent additional capital on the reconversion back. $4 billion in, money spent to reverse it. Net result. A plant building the same category of trucks it built before any of this started, and a line on the balance sheet that represents the pure financial definition of going nowhere. That is not a pivot. That is a round trip on a one-way ticket that cost shareholders $8 billion before you count anything else. The write-offs do not exist in isolation. They exist because GM built a product lineup that the market systematically rejected, and in some cases, GM had to pull the products before the market even got the chance to say no. The Chevrolet Blazer EV launched in the summer of 2023 as the mainstream electric SUV that was going to bring the Ultium platform to everyday buyers at a real volume. By December 22nd of that same year, GM issued an 11-week stop sale order. Not a recall, not a service bulletin, a full stop sale. Dealers could not move inventory. Customers who had already ordered could not take delivery. The infotainment software was failing in the field. DC fast charging, the single most critical functional requirement of any EV sold in America, did not work reliably. GM delivered 402 Blazer EVs in all of 2023, 482 units. In a segment where competitors were moving tens of thousands of vehicles, GM managed 482 before they had to shut the whole thing down. The GMC Hummer EV is a different category of failure. A £9,000 electric truck at over $100,000 getting roughly 3 miles per kilowatt-hour in real-world conditions. Dealers were clearing margins of approximately $3,000 per unit on a six-figure sale. Quarterly volume never cleared 500 units across the entire country. The Hummer EV was not a product. It was an engineering demonstration with a window sticker. Demonstrations do not save balance sheets. Then there is the decision that might be the single most revealing move in this entire story. The Chevrolet Bolt, the one EV in GM's lineup that regular people were actually buying, an affordable, proven, genuinely functional electric car with a loyal customer base, got discontinued at the end of 2023. GM killed it to retool the Orion plant for the electric trucks that never got built there. They discontinued the product the market wanted to make room for the products the market rejected. Then they spent $4 billion converting Orion back. That sequence of decisions does not require commentary. The facts are the commentary. And then there was BrightDrop. GM's electric commercial delivery van launched with the kind of press fanfare that made it sound like a category-defining product. By May 2025, the Ingersoll, Ontario plant was sitting idle. On October 21, 2025, GM officially killed the entire BrightDrop program. The commercial EV market was, in GM's own language, much slower than expected. The $40,000 commercial EV tax credit that underpinned the business case had been eliminated. Another billion-dollar bet. Zero return. And this is where the story gets ugly. Because EVs were not the only place Barra was pouring capital into a bottomless hole. In 2016, GM acquired a self-driving startup called Cruise for $581 million. The vision was autonomous robo-taxis operating in major American cities. GM was going to own the future of urban transportation. Barra's team put a number on it in investor presentations, $50 billion in annual revenue. That number got repeated in front of analysts and shareholders like it was a projection backed by data rather than a projection backed by ambition. Here is what the data actually shows. Cruise burned through more than $10 billion in cumulative operating losses across 8 years against less than $500 million in total revenue. $10 billion in, $500 million out. Then in October 2023, a Cruise vehicle in San Francisco struck a pedestrian and dragged her 20 feet. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration levied a $1.5 million fine. Cruise's CEO resigned. An independent investigation surfaced serious failures in both company culture and leadership decision-making. California pulled Cruise's operating permit entirely. On December 10, 2024, Barra shut the robo-taxi program down completely. Whatever remained got folded into an internal driver assistance division. The $50 billion revenue projection disappeared from every investor deck without acknowledgement or explanation. $10 billion, 8 years, put a fine, a resignation, a regulatory shutdown and a 2-sentence press release about integrating the remaining technology. That is not a failed moonshot. That is a decade of misallocated capital that could have funded competitive truck development, dealer support, worker retention, or any number of things that would have actually served the business. Instead, it funded a vision that never made contact with reality. But here is the part that should make you physically angry. Because everything described so far, the failed products, the converted and reconverted factories, the robo-taxi bonfire, all of it happened while the external conditions still gave GM room to absorb the losses. Then 2025 arrived and every single pillar holding up the EV business case collapsed at the same time. The $7,500 federal EV tax credit that had been propping up consumer demand since the Inflation Reduction Act passed, gone. President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on July 4, 2025, eliminating the credit 8 years ahead of the original schedule. The $4,000 used EV credit, gone. Have $40,000 commercial EV credit that BrightDrop's entire business model depended on, gone. California's EV sales mandates, the regulatory pressure that had been forcing every major automaker to build electric vehicles whether the market wanted them or not, revoked. And then the tariffs. A 25% tariff on imported vehicles. The Chevrolet Equinox EV, GM's one legitimate volume seller in the electric lineup, the vehicle that hit 25,000 units in Q3 2025, is built in Mexico. The Blazer EV is built in Mexico. 25% tariff on both of them overnight. The result was mechanical and inevitable. Buyers had rushed to lock in the $7,500 credit before the September 30th deadline, inflating Q3 2025 numbers across the entire industry. Then the credit died. GM's Q4 2025 EV sales crashed 43% year-over-year, 25,219 units. The Equinox EV went from 25,000 units in Q3 to 5,111 units in Q4. The Blazer EV fell to 1,812. Q1 2026 dropped another 19% to 25,851 units. Industry forecasters now project EVs will account for just 6% of total US vehicle sales in 2026, down from 7.4% in 2025. For the first time in over a decade, the EV market is not slowing down, it is shrinking. The tax incentives that made EVs affordable, gone. The regulations that compelled automakers to build them, gone. The tariffs that made imported EVs more expensive overnight, active. Every external condition that made GM's EV strategy viable evaporated inside a single calendar year, and every other major automaker read those conditions and responded accordingly. Ford took a $19.5 billion write-down on its EV division in December 2025, killed the next-generation electric F-150 Lightning, and pushed EV profitability out to 2029. Ford CEO Jim Farley said the math does not work. Stellantis booked $26.5 billion in EV-related charges, abandoned its Dare Forward 2030 plan that had committed to 100% EV sales in Europe, sold its stake in a battery joint venture, and projected a net loss of $19 to $21 billion for 2025. Cancelled its entire EV lineup, the Zero Saloon, the Zero SUV, the Acura RSX, and took $15.7 billion in restructuring charges, its first operating loss since 1957. Ford pulled back. Stellantis pulled back, Honda pulled back. GM looked at $7.6 billion in annual losses, a collapsed robo-taxi division, a shrinking market, dead tax credits, reconverted factories, and a 25% tariff on its two best-selling EVs, and announced it was going harder. That is not a business decision, that is a CEO refusing to read a room that is on fire. On January 12, 2026, Barra stood in front of the Automotive Press Association in Detroit and said she has no regrets. She called electrification GM's North Star. She said, and this is a direct quote, that given everything they knew at the time, they would have made the same decisions. She cited a statistic claiming buyers who purchase one EV are 80% more likely to purchase another. 80% loyalty means nothing when the first sale is not happening. When Q4 volume is down 43%, when the credit that made the first sale possible no longer exists. 2 weeks later, GM reported the full Q4 numbers. The roughly $6 billion Q4 EV charge hit the books. Combined with the Q3 charges, the $1.1 billion China joint venture restructuring, and the ongoing operational losses, 2025 ended with net income down 55% to $2.7 billion. Barra's response was a new EV platform launching in 2028, more battery investment with LG, a level 3 autonomous driving system, more bets, same direction, same language. The stock jumped 9% the day the write-down was announced, hit 87.31 cents. Morgan Stanley upgraded GM to overweight with a $90 price target. Wall Street rewarded GM for finally admitting the EV strategy was not working, not for fixing it. That tells you exactly what the market thinks of the next round of promises. How will the people getting hurt by these decisions never got a vote on them? The workers at Orion Assembly who were told their plant was going electric, retrained, repositioned, and then told the plant was going back. They did not choose that. The BrightDrop employees in Ingersoll who watched the factory go idle and then got the call that the whole program was dead, they did not choose that. The GM dealers sitting on lots full of Blazer EVs at negative margin who cannot get out from under the inventory, they did not choose any of this either. But you still have a choice. And right now that choice is clearer than it has been in years. GM's desperation to move EV inventory before the tariff math gets worse is creating real discount pressure on Equinox EV and Blazer EV units sitting on dealer lots right now. If you are in the market for an electric vehicle and you understand the limitations, Range, charging infrastructure, resale trajectory. This is the window. Dealers are negotiating. Incentives that did not exist 6 months ago are on the table because the alternative is carrying that inventory into a worsening tariff environment. If you are not in the market for an EV, the bigger opportunity is in GM's gas-powered truck inventory. When a manufacturer is bleeding $8 billion on one side of the business, the pressure to generate cash on the other side gets intense. Watch the Silverado and Sierra incentive programs over the next 2 quarters. Stacking manufacturer cash with dealer discount on trucks that have been sitting is producing deals right now that are hard to find in a normal market. Know what you are buying before you sign anything. Pull the VIN history. Get the pre-purchase inspection. Understand the tariff exposure on Mexico-built units if you are considering an EV. The discount is real. The risk is real too. The buyer who does the homework captures the value. The buyer who just sees the sticker price and signs captures the liability. GM reports Q2 2026 earnings in July. The company has already warned that additional EV-related charges will carry into this year as supplier contracts close out. If those numbers confirm what the Q1 sales trajectory is already showing, the pressure on Barra's position becomes a story in its own right. And the incentive programs that follow that announcement will be the most aggressive GM has run in years. Subscribe before those numbers drop, because the window between the earnings report and the inventory response is where the real opportunities are, and it closes fast. GM did not lose $8 billion because the market failed them. The market told them the truth in 2023, then again in 2024, then again every quarter of 2025. The losses are what happens when a corporation mistakes its own press releases for evidence. The buyers who walked away made the right call. The question now is whether the people still inside that building are capable of making a different one. The record says no.